Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective, day 226 of the war in Israel. Today I'm with Daniel, and we're talking about turmoil in the Israeli war cabinet. Shakespeare told us that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that's exactly what seems to be going on right now. So Benny Gantz, very senior figure in Israeli politics, has issued a six-point plan stating that if the demands of this plan are not met, he's going to resign from the government by the 8th of June. And there's a few statements that he made, but one of them was saying that if you choose the path of fanatics and lead the entire nation to the abyss, we'll be forced to quit the government. So he seems particularly upset with the kind of far right aspects of the cabinet. Now, Daniel is our expert in Israeli domestic politics, so he's going to give us the inside perspective. So, Daniel, why don't you elaborate on some of this for us?
So, okay, first of all, I thought the quote was from Lincoln, but okay. Then the most important. So basically, there is a site title for the show, and it's "Why Daniel Hates Parliamentary Systems," and we'll talk about the Israeli parliamentary system. So we'll talk also about the demands from Gantz, but mainly how did we get here? What's going on? So Israeli Parliament, Knesset, 120 members. It's also unicameral, which means it just has one. When you have something like U.S., you have the House and the Senate, so there is a certain separation of power. And also, I think the main purpose it usually serves is to slow down the radicalism and also slow down basically, too quick of a change. Israel doesn't have anything like that. And I'm familiar with the system because Slovakia has the similar one, so I can speak from a certain experience. So what's going on right now is since October 7th, after the Palestinians attacked Israel, there has been basically what's called unity government has been formed. Unity governments usually, the main purpose of it is to solve some problem, which in this case it's war, and sort of put everything else aside. So it's sort of a bringing together all different parties just to focus on one issue. So for example, when we talked about the change in the judiciary that was going on in Israel before October 7th, so that was basically put on hold because of for this unity government. The way it works right now is the actual Israeli government has 64 members, which you need at least 61 for the majority, basically to be able to govern. But they also get the 7 votes from as a sort of like a unity support. So it's the way it usually works is a certain party gives a support for the government while not being actually a part of government. And national unity, which is which at the head is Benny Gantz, is giving support for the current government. So what it would mean if they got out, they would took away their 8 votes, their 8 members, and Netanyahu would be left with 64, which, and I'll talk about this later, but basically this would mean that pretty much any party within the current government could threaten leaving and basically get a certain power over Netanyahu. So basically in the current government, it's like 5 or 6 parties, while in the whole of Knesset, it's like 15 different parties that are currently there. So this is the first reason why I hate parliamentary systems. So we've seen this in the past. Basically, there was also a party called New Hope, which I think was led by a guy called Gideon Sar, who was, I believe, originally from Likud, and he also left. He also left from the government because he demanded to be in the war cabinet. Before I talk about war cabinet, Morgan, do you have anything to say so far?
Well, I'm curious, what is it about the parliamentary system that you don't like in this case? Like, what's drawing this out of you?
So I think this is the first reason when you have, so first the difference between the two systems. When you have let's say, compared to America, or for example, also France has a presidential system, you elect the head of government, or basically the head of the executive power. So when you have in the US, that's why in the US you could have what's called a divided government, when you have a Republican president and a Democratic either House or Senate or both. And you still have the executive, you still elect the president. The president does his executive things. He still has to basically lead the nation, but he might have the opposing legislature, which would mean he cannot pass any actual laws. He can only do what's in his power as a president. What you have in this parliamentary system is you elect parties, which basically mean in one election you elect a parliament, but also by that extension you are also electing everything in the executive power. So for example, when you elect Netanyahu, or the way I saw the elections usually work in Israel is the coalition and the opposition, or the potential coalitions, are already decided before the election, which is something a bit more, let's say, unique than from Slovakia. So it's like Netanyahu forces and anti-Netanyahu forces, and basically when they count the votes, they are counting, okay, who's gonna have the members to actually form a government. But basically, you elect the parties, and then they decide how they wanna form a government. The problem I have with this is, there is a certain principle called separation of power. You want to have the three branches of government, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative powers. You want them to have a certain separation so that one person doesn't completely take over the nation and does whatever he wants to do with it. So there are certain checks and balances. And I think in a parliamentary system this is lacking, because when you elect your legislature, you're also electing a government. You cannot really say, I want to vote for this party, but I want this person to lead the nation. You don't really have that. So that would be my first main problem.
Mm-hmm. But how is this applying to Israel? Like, what's the problem here with separation of powers?
So let's explain the war cabinet. So we talked about the unity government, which is basically when parties from usually even from opposite sides come together to basically lead the nation. I think actually right after October 7, there was also a talk between the main and I'm trying to quickly find there was also the talks between Netanyahu and is this Yair Lapid, which is the leader of the opposition. So you would basically have, and he was the main opposition to Netanyahu, and he offered that he would come in together. So there was talks between them to basically form this unity government. And I think the main reason for it is to stop the more extremist parties to form the unity government with Netanyahu. But this hasn't happened, and Netanyahu instead went with the more sort of extremist parties, and also the parties in the center, which the parties in the center are actually trying to, with the National Unity Party that we talked about, who the head is Benny Gantz, is actually now discussing about leaving the unity government, or rather the war cabinet. So now about the war cabinet. Basically, this has been formed after October 7. It's this basically decision body with three members who actually have this decisions. It's Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, and Yoav Gallant, who is the defense minister. Basically, it's this the decision body to basically make decisions and be able to keep discuss what's going on with the war and keep going forward. But there's been many problems with it, especially between Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, who I believe are not even on speaking terms right now. Yoav Gallant has been criticizing Netanyahu for similar reason to Benny Gantz, and I think the main problem both of them have with Benjamin Netanyahu is that he still hasn't gave any plan for the post war Gaza or what's gonna happen to it.
So should we go over the 6 points then?
Yeah, I think we. Let's jump back a little bit, and the reason why this him leaving would be a problem. So as I said, currently the government has 64 votes out of 61 needed, but they are also getting a support from Benny Gantz and his party National Unity, so they're getting 8 votes, which means 72. This means that none of the parties in the government can come with an ultimatum to Netanyahu, basically saying, if you don't do this, we will leave, and that would mean the government falls. Because if any single party leaves right now, they still have the majority to be able to rule. If Benny Gantz leaves, this would mean someone like Ben Gvir from the Otzma Yehudit, I think the translation is Jewish Power, who is a very extremist, like Jewish supremacist leader. He has it has been happening a lot in the past that he's been demanding certain things from Netanyahu, and if he doesn't do it, he would leave. If Benny Gantz leaves, it would mean that Ben Gvir would actually have the power to basically say, we will leave, and this would basically put down the government, which it's not something you want to happen while the war is still going on. So usually what it means, and again, the problem with the parliamentary system is that you have these like small parties, like he has 6 members out of 120, but if Benny Gantz leaves, he would be essentially able to control the government because of this like small power. Or because of this decision-making power over if the government stands or not.
Mm-hmm. And so does Israel have proportional representation then?
Yes, I believe so. The way it works is proportional. There is a certain name for the system called, but basically every party that gets at least 3.25, I believe, % of the votes gets a seat in the government, or a seat in the parliament, sorry. So you have a lot of parties with like 2, 3, 4 seats, and only like a couple like big parties.
Interesting. Yeah, proportional representation does tend to lead to those problems. But let's go into these 6 points then that Gantz has set up.
Okay, so the first one that I mentioned is the comprehensive post-war plan. I'm wondering what your opinion is on it. The way I see it is, or at least the way I understand, Netanyahu is not giving any plans. Is I think it can only hurt him. Either his plan will be too let's say harsh, and he would lose support from the more centrist parties, such as either Gallant, the defense minister, or Benny Gantz, or it would be so like weak that he might have a problems with his, let's say, more radical parts of his government. So at least that's the reason why I see, and I think that's why people are pushing, or at least the more centrist parties are pushing him to have a plan, so they know, okay, what are you actually gonna do after the war? Like, we are giving you the support now, even though we would normally not agree with you, we would normally not be in government with you. We are giving you support basically to, to protect Israel, to finish this war. But what's your plans after?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think politicians often feel in a situation where they can't make any decision, without upsetting anyone. And certainly for Netanyahu, domestically, but also internationally, he's got to feel really kind of hemmed in and like he can't take a single step without upsetting anyone. So I think that's a plausible reason why he's not giving a plan. It might also just be because he doesn't know. I mean, it's a tough situation to clean up without being really decisive and actually quite harsh in certain respects. And and lots of modern politicians just don't have the stomach for it. So I think you're probably right that he doesn't want to upset people, but also he might just not have the stomach. Even though he's regarded as a pretty, tough old boot, he just may not have that. He's certainly indecisive on many other things where we would expect him to be decisive, and it takes some guts. So he seems to like those things. But let's go on.
So someone in the chat says you can have less than 4 seats. I believe that's right because of the percentages. But what usually or oftentimes happens in the parliamentary systems is that you have coalitions running, and oftentimes when that happens, you could have like one single party ticket, but like 5 different parties after it, like on that ticket. And when they get into the parliament, oftentimes then they don't actually stay as one group, but they separate. So even now in the government, you have the party called Noam, which has one current member. And I think there's a couple others that have like 2 or 3 members in the parliament because of this. But yeah, so the next point is return of the hostages. I haven't found anything more about this specific point, about what it exactly means. I'm sure everybody would agree on this, although I'm guessing in this basically, or at least coming from Benny Gantz, return of the hostages might mean like actual negotiation or like getting some deal with Hamas. So I think that's why that point might be problematic.
Sure. Well, give me a sense of, so where exactly is Gans coming from in terms of, is he a real firebrand destroyer of Hamas, or is he a bit softer, kind of, we're going to negotiate and leave things unfinished?
To be fair, I don't know enough about specifically him to know exactly about it. I mean, like we talked about, that there's been some parties who have, or a party that have already left the government. So I think this might need someone with more knowledge. I don't know enough to know. Maybe I can look up something quickly while you talk about the next point.
Well, I don't have them in front of me, so you'll need to.
I can say. So the next one is establishment of an alternative to Hamas. I think, from what I understand, what this means would be some sort of like civil government. Obviously not of Hamas members, but also not like something that would constitute Israeli occupation. I think it's something like international, some sort of handling of it. I think this has been something that has been talked about like months ago, some sort of like coalition between Israel, Saudi Arabia, USA.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, yeah.
Certainly the plan that was floated around by certain prominent businessmen included a part of it that was, they had this acronym for it, but it was something like the Palestinian Reconstruction Authority or the Gaza Reconstruction Authority, something like that. And that was meant to be a government after a certain amount of time that would be made up of the Palestinians. There was also, which was initially going to be run by the Arab neighbors who were going to be drafted in to help, but eventually it was going to be of the Palestinians. And I have to say, I don't really like that idea, and because, at least not for a long time, because what needs to happen in the next few years is a real de-radicalization of the Gazan society. And so any plan that immediately is leaping to, and we give them governmental power, I think is jumping the gun. Certainly that businessman plan didn't pay enough attention to de-radicalization. And by giving, and it actually placed the responsibility for de-radicalization in the hands of the Palestinians, as if they had any group in mind who were already de-radicalized that they could trust to do that and wouldn't be infiltrated. So yeah, I think that's a pretty bad idea, unless he's got some amazing fleshed out plan. But just on the face of it, that seems like a very bad point in my mind.
Yeah, I think, and this connects to the next point, which is normalization with Saudi Arabia. This is his 4th point. This, I think, is something I'm trying to remember. I think it was this happened shortly before October 7. There was some potential normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We talked about it on the channel, and I think some people were coming out saying, "Oh, Saudi Arabia shouldn't try to normalize with Israel," as if Saudi Arabia was the problematic partner in that normalization. I don't think Israel as like a Western democratic nation should have any sort of relationship with an actual dictatorships in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think there's a problem with us insisting on that in the sense that people aren't gonna get why, because other Western powers do this kind of thing all the time. And of course, we say that they shouldn't. They should hold their diplomatic relations and their friendship at a much higher price. And I can understand why, from Israel's perspective, after having been enemies with a lot of these countries for decades and maybe feeling a bit worn out by it, and if there's a chance just to not exactly be allies, but at least to again to have things normalized, to not be in a state of just paused hostilities. I can understand why you might think that's attractive, but really what Israel needs is real allies in the West so that it can say to these countries, no, we're not going to be your friends because you're pariahs and you're awful and we're better than you. And it would need the backing of the West probably really to do that fully comfortably. But since it lacks that, and since the West tramples all over that kind of principle all the time by making friends with these people, by sending dittery old men like Joe Biden out to go and dance with the sheikhs and their headdresses and so on, the West doesn't exactly blaze a trail on that front. So that's, I mean, it's not the worst thing that he could be insisting on, but it's a problematic one.
Well, it's something that has been already, pretty much almost going to happen before October 7. And that connects to another point, which is strengthening regional alliances. Again, I think it's pretty much, it means something similar to, normalizing with Saudi Arabia. But again, I don't think, I cannot think of any like actual allies Israel has in the Middle East. And again, what it would mean allies against what, and again, for what purpose?
Well, yeah, it probably means, so those countries which have already signed the Abraham Accords, normalized relations, probably means building up upon those would be my guess. But again, what Israel really has to gain by that. Now, if you're looking at this in a very narrow sense, kind of Henry Kissinger realpolitik sense, you might think that there's a lot to gain from that. And in the short term, there could be things which are advantageous, don't get me wrong. But if you're thinking about this in the long term, which has to be the perspective over which you're thinking, then Rand has a principle that the good has nothing to gain from evil. And in fact, it has everything to lose. And a lot of these neighboring countries, which are presumably being thought of by Benny Gantz here, really are evil. They're really awful tyrannies, which really oppress their own people, expropriate their wealth, torture them, spy on them in lots of ways. And Israel shouldn't want anything to do with these countries until they start becoming better. So yeah, I would think this is a poor idea.
And the last point is defense and security improvements. Again, it's hard to say what it means. Although, from what I've read, one problem that, and I wish I kept it up. So basically, when there were talks, let me quickly look it up. When there were talks between Yair Lapid of the main opposition party and Netanyahu, and so one of the reasons the government was not formed, or at least that Yair Lapid has stated that he didn't want to be in the government with Netanyahu, is that the people who he considered responsible for October 7, the people who, let's say the defense minister or the head of the intelligence or security, those people would still remain in government under Netanyahu's unity government. So I'm wondering if this point is actually anything close to that, if he actually would demand some resignations, people actually taking responsibility. Because again, Netanyahu should probably be the first one to take responsibility for October 7 when it happened. And I believe, so again, I'm not sure what this would mean. But that's the last point. Any comments on that?
Well, it's interesting that he's laid these down as the points over which he will resign if they're not met. Again, some of them seemed a bit strange in the sense that they're things I would be expecting Netanyahu to be doing really anyway, such to the point about the return of the hostages. Whilst Netanyahu is insisting on the destruction of Hamas and that the war will not finish before they're destroyed, I don't see anything that indicates that he doesn't want the hostages returned. And I would expect him actually, again, to dither and delay, and so on until to ensure the return of the hostages. So, but yeah, we saw him make that deal, for example, I think back in November, where there was a ceasefire in exchange for hostages. So that seems a bit strange to me. And on a couple of the other points. So this whole insistence by Gantz, I wonder whether there's more to it, to be honest, in the background about why he's doing this. I don't know if he's playing to the Israeli public to seem principled and strong. I don't know if he's doing this to maneuver for position within the government in various ways. It's not exactly clear to me. Gantz is certainly someone who I hear people talking about as a future leader of Israel. So he's probably got that in mind himself when he's making these kind of points. I would have to think, but I'm not too sure. What do you think?
So he's someone who already has been a prime minister, or I think it was basically a deal when you had, in a sense, two prime ministers who alternated between each other in like 2020 or something like that. So I checked out the polls and I was wondering if there are any indications there. So I know that Likud has fallen, and overall the government parties, if there was an election and all the parties like they are currently would run, the government would lose a lot of seats, maybe like 15 or 16. But the national unity under Benny Gantz hasn't really gained anything. So although Otzma Yehudit has gotten a lot more percentages, so we've definitely seen the rise of the extremism during this war. So at least in some sense, I think the Israeli public might want a bit more aggressive reaction or aggressive way to solve this conflict. But again, that's the really problematic thing with the current parties, is that you don't really have someone who has the right approach to the war in the way we would consider, and is not completely batshit crazy otherwise.
Sure. Well, that's probably a good note to leave things on because we have the reality show Extra coming up in just 60 seconds. So that's for ARC UK members and channel members only. And we're going to be talking today about the show Baby Reindeer that's on Netflix, which has, exploded in popularity. We're going to talk about the show itself, a little bit of what we think about it, then also some of the wider context, the infamous, I think it's fair to say now, interview on Piers Morgan with the real Martha, quote unquote, and all of that kind of stuff and what we think about it. So I hope to see some of you guys over there. I want to hear what you guys think about Baby Reindeer and all that good stuff. So thank you very much, guys, and we'll see you later.
Bye-bye.